For this assignment, I decided to examine the relationship between form and content in big budget animated films over time. Now, what do I mean by that? So, the essential question that I decided to ask was, how have these different forms of animation changed the kind of stories we see in big budget films, and what other factors are at play? Uh, when I talk about form, what I'm talking about is the way you animate a character. So stop motion, think Wallace and Gromit, taking clay or other physical objects and moving them tiny little bits and taking pictures of it, and then playing that at a rate where it looks like they're moving. 3D rendered animation is very similar to that, except you're doing it in a digital space and you have a lot more options for how you want to puppet your physical object. And then, of course, there's classic 2D animation where you're just hand drawing every single frame, every frame of movement at least, and then playing that back. And for the purpose of the study, I decided it would be best to focus on just 2D and computer generated animation. Stop motion is really cool, but a lot of big budget studios don't really use it because it's very labor intensive. And so I thought it would make sense to just focus on these two. The scope of this research, in addition to just being 2D and 3D films, is limited to American animation. There's a lot of really interesting trends in international animation over history, but there aren't a lot of relevant studies written about those, so I thought I'd focus on American ones. Also, American TV shows are really cool and interesting, but they're influenced by a lot of different factors compared to film. So I thought, again, I'll focus just on film. So understanding the history of 2D animated film is a good place to start where if you want to understand this history. And the important thing to understand is that 2D animation has a lot of specific guidelines that you need to work within, or else you're just going to be working for a really long time. 2D animation is best when you have a small amount of characters moving on a fairly flat background. Now, Disney, because they made the first feature-length animated film, they had to find ways to make this work within a feature-length animated film. So early Disney films focused on public domain fairy tales set in these rural locations where the backgrounds could remain fairly still. And their storytelling methods were also very conservative. You see a lot of stories where characters begin in a wonderful environment and then bad people come and change it, and it's up to these characters to change it back to the way it was. It's a very conservative type of storytelling. These films were also produced mostly in the United States by people at the Disney studio. They didn't have as many workers as they do today. And in general, the audience for these were white, middle class, and young. Very much aged towards children of the age that would appreciate fairy tales. But that all changes when we go to 3D animated films. Now, computer-generated animation, where it differs from 2D, is that you don't move characters as much as you move the camera. And so you can have a lot of characters on screen, you can have a lot of movement on screen that doesn't actually cost a lot of time and energy to make. And the result of this is that computer-generated animation is generally a lot more cost-effective to produce on a large scale and is better suited for animating movement. Another important factor to consider is that adults, when asked if they'd rather, or when presented with a 2D film or a 3D film, they're more likely to watch the 3D film just because they have a lot of associations about 2D animation to be for kids. And that's important to consider. Now, these films, unlike the early Disney films, were produced by really big teams with a lot of studios all over the world. Lots of studios in India, Korea, a lot of places in the developing world, but even a few studios in Canada. and other parts of Europe as well. Um, Now, like I said earlier, these films take place in or are able to utilize movement really well, which means that these rural environments, while there's plenty of CG animated films that take place in rural environments, there's a lot more that take place in urban environments. And the storytelling ramifications for that are pretty enormous. They're a lot more interested in societies and how cultures interact with each other. Typically, 3D animated films will follow an outcast in a society, and we navigate what it's like to be that outcast and as they rise the ranks. Think films like The Bee Movie or Wreck-It Ralph, How to Train Your Dragon. These are all examples of that kind of liberal allegory. But even Zootopia is a great example. And as a result of this a little more politically charged storytelling, there's a wider audience that 3D animated films are interested in. So that's all well and good, but what does that really mean? Like, what other factors are guiding this? Because it can't just be the medium. So an underlying cause of this change was mentioned earlier, which is that there's a lot more outsourcing. And in general, animation, and specifically animation coming from really big studios, is a lot more interested in globalization. So according to a study in 2015, this trend of outsourcing animation labor has been really on the rise since 1970. A lot of TV shows do it because of all the bulk animation that's necessary, but now even big films have started to outsource a lot of their animation as well. There are certain animation studios that focus just on explosions or other kind of really niche types of animation. And because of this, Disney can't really afford to appeal to these narrow market and audiences that they once had with these 2D animated films. They simply can't afford to shoot that small. Now, the conclusion we can draw from this is that, like a lot of industries, animation is becoming extremely globalized at an astonishing rate. It's just a general trend around the world, and there's nothing really good or bad about that necessarily on its face. And in terms of this new switch to computer-generated films, and one of the reasons why I don't think we see as many 2D animated films anymore, we can ascertain from all this is that computer-generated animation is a medium that is now better suited to tell stories about larger societies than 2D was. And now a generally older audience is now more receptive to adult themes, and while still being interested in animation. And also, Disney and other corporations like Disney are operating on a business model that encourages expansion into these global markets. So having stories that appeal to wide groups of people, but are also not treating their audience like children, is really helpful for Disney and other corporations as an asset. Now, another conclusion I can draw is that 2D animation, of course, still has a place in the entertainment industry. It's still really important, but I think it's better suited for television and film from smaller studios, more kind of artsy productions. It's very rare that really big studios will dive into 2D for a big studio film just because of all the work it requires to make it. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate it.